Let's turn now to Andrea Mitchell, the host of this show, with a very special guest. Take it away, Andrea, in Houston.
Thank you so much, Kristen Welker. And I am here at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy for their Presidential Campaign Election Forum with a very special guest, as you point out, the former Secretary of State, former Treasury Secretary, former White House Chief of Staff in the Reagan administration, James A. Baker III, and the founder of the Baker Institute. Thank you very much for welcoming us here.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, a summit with Kim Jongun, the first summit between a North Korean leader and an American president, if it takes place. And we see overnight China's role in welcoming Kim Jong-un for what we believe to be his first foreign visit of all, with all of the red carpets and the pomp and circumstance. What does this tell you about what China is trying to do here?
Well, I think they're doing what they ought to do, and that's staying close to their client state, North Korea. They've got a big interest in making sure a couple of things don't happen. One, they don't want a failed state there. They don't want a whole lot of refugees flowing across the border into China, and they don't want U.S. troops on their border. Which would be the case, of course, if the United States and South Korea ended up with a very friendly government there in North Korea. So I think that China is doing what China ought to do. But what I'm struck by, really, frankly, Andrea, is that the United States and China both have a problem with the past behavior of North Korea and Kim Jong-un. I mean, China's not happy with the idea that they're going to have a heavily nuclear-armed Korean peninsula right there on their border. They don't want to see that. We don't want to see that. So I think it's too bad that there wasn't some way that we could work with the Chinese to achieve this result, denuclearization of the peninsula. China is the only country in the world that really has any influence, significant influence on North Korea. So, but that's not the route we're going. We're going the route of negotiating with North Korea. That's fine. I'm a great believer in diplomacy. I also am a realist, and I know what's happened since 1994. We've seen the North Koreans talk a lot, but not do anything constructive by way of reducing their missiles and development of nuclear weapons.
You're, in the past, someone who has prepared for big summits. This was so unprepared that the president just said, yes, I'll go, as the South Koreans were preparing to brief him and make decisions on whether to go.
Well, I think the South Koreans probably are pleased with this decision. They want to see us.
But shouldn't the president have waited and thought it through and planned it better?
You could make that argument, and that certainly was the way we used to do things. But he's president. He's the decider. And so we are where we are. Having said that, there is some chance, I suppose, that an agreement could be crafted that would provide for denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. We ought to make sure we stick with that as our goal. That, of course, would require extensive verification procedures on the ground, anywhere, anytime, any place type stuff.
Let me just ask you about the risks here. If he goes in with great expectations and it's way too complicated to have real results in a first meeting, what's the downside if he comes away and Kim Jong-un disappointed? What's the alternative?
It's the same downside you face in any decision you make in politics. You want to always be able to exceed expectations. That's how you do well in politics. That's how some of the people I worked for, frankly, were so successful. Everybody totally underestimated Ronald Reagan, but he exceeded expectations. But you don't want to fail to meet expectations.
And if you fail here?
If you failed here, then you better be prepared to know what your next step is going to be. And everybody knows the cataclysmic consequences of a war on the Korean Peninsula in terms of loss of life, primarily Korean loss of life.
And the failure here would mean going to a military option?
Well, we don't know whether it would mean that or not, but it's very likely that it could. You know, I don't know the degree or extent to which we could take out North Korea's nuclear capability. I'm told that we could get the vast majority of it in surgical strike type activity. But that's not a very good option in my view. And let's hope that somehow we find a breakthrough diplomatically. But China is the answer. And what I would have done if I was in there, I would have sent some high-level envoy to Xi Jinping, the president of China, that the Chinese trust and have confidence in. And I would have said, look, you don't like what's going on in the Korean Peninsula. We don't like what's going on. Why don't we cooperate to stop it? And we, the United States, will support any government you install in North Korea, provided they repudiate the acquisition or maintenance of nuclear weapons. We will trade with that government. We will establish diplomatic relations. We will execute a peace treaty ending the Korean War. We'll do all these things. Your job is to put a government in place there that's different than this government, and one that repudiates or, acquisition or maintenance.
You're talking about regime change.
Yeah, well, that's what it would be. But the Chinese are not happy. We're not happy. Now, this guy either is going to change his behavior and actually agree to denuclearization, or neither the United States nor China are going to be happy. So at some point, you're going to get to the question of regime change. The only thing we would be asking China to do is take care of that change. And they're in a position to do it. They'll say, oh, no, we can't do that. We don't have that kind of influence. I don't believe that. China controls everything that happens in North Korea. If they want to, they can cut off exports from North Korea and so forth.
Let me ask you about Russia. The president, on one hand, a week ago, congratulates Vladimir Putin on a sham election in contradiction to his own advice, being written in big, bold capital letters, and doesn't bring up the fact that the Kremlin tried to kill a former Russian spy and his daughter on English soil with a nerve agent that is a banned chemical weapon, even though he'd been told to do that. And then a week later, we're expelling more spies than any time since the Cold War.
That's right. What does
the world think? What does Putin think about this?
I think it's important to I think message discipline is really important in running a campaign or in running the White House. I think there could be an improvement in this White House with message discipline, needless to say. On the other hand, I would remind you that Ronald Reagan, for whom I worked for 8 years, told the bureaucrats at one point when they told him, don't say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's terrible. You're going to create a terrible problem. He said, look, I'm president. This is what I'm going to say. And he wrote it back in the speech. So that turned out all right.
Let me ask you about Twitter. You've got a president who fires his Secretary of State, notifies him on Twitter, and calls Kim Jongun Rocket Man, and the next minute is talking about
I thought that was
summit.
rather humorous.
But how does this affect American diplomacy and America's position in the world if people, diplomats overseas, don't know which president is going to show up?
To be effective as Secretary of State, you have to have the full support. You have to be seamless with your president because you're in his lane, you're in his turf, and Secretary of State has to be supported, protected, and defended by the president if he's going to be effective. And I thought that firing Rex Tillerson that way was absolutely the wrong thing to do. I just think it's too bad that happened the way it did. I'm proud of Rex for being willing to serve. I called him and told him that, and I'm sorry that it ended the way it did.
Could you be Secretary of State if the president's son-in-law is taking care of the Middle East, China, Mexico, and the Persian Gulf? You
need to make sure that the president, when he asks you to serve, and this applies as well to Secretary-designate Pompeo, that he wants you to in fact be his Secretary of State in the way the statute calls for, that you're his primary foreign policy advisor and implementer, and that you're his chief spokesman. And if everybody in Washington, as you know, wants a piece of the foreign policy turf, and you can't be an effective Secretary of State unless the president empowers you and makes sure everybody else gets out of your turf.
Would you blow up the Iran deal next month?
I don't know. I was not. I was not enamored with the result.
But now that it's there,
I think
and the rest of
blowing
the
it
world's
up. I
behind
think
it.
blowing it up could be very problematic, and I'll tell you why. Because I don't think that we're going to be able. I think what brought the Iranians to the table, and it was very effective, were multilateral sanctions joined in by our Western European allies. If they're not going to be there, if we blow up the deal, they're going to point to us. It's going to be really hard for us to continue sanctions or to enhance sanctions. If we don't, we might be able to get them to convince them, hey, look, you want to keep this agreement going, then let's get stronger sanctions. Let's make sure they stay in effect. That's the way I would have gone. That's the way I would have gone.
If you were the new Secretary of State, let's say Mike Pompeo gets confirmed, what about John Bolton as National Security Advisor? How do you be the chief foreign policy advisor, as you've described it, with someone as strong and as smart and as good a bureaucratic infighter as John Bolton?
John's an extraordinarily bright guy. I gave him his first job, I think, in government in the first Reagan term when I suggested that he find a spot in the White House counsel's office. He was very effective for us. He was effective in the first Bush administration, controversial in the second Bush administration. John has some very deeply held views, many of which I disagree with fundamentally. But I know he's a patriot, and he's an extraordinarily able and capable public servant. Now, will he get along? Will he defer to the Secretary of State the way he should? The job he's now in is one of consensus and coordination, not so much one of articulating your own views, although you're free to express those to the president. Time will tell.
The president has apparently told some advisors that he doesn't need to have a chief of staff. John Kelly seems to be on thin ice. You were a chief of staff. How important is that role?
I think it's pretty darn important because the White House is big, the administration is big. You know, running an administration is not a lot different than running a political campaign for president. So you need organization, you need message discipline, you need procedures, you need processes. You can't have everybody just running in anytime they want to into the Oval Office. You had that at the beginning of the Clinton administration, then they corrected it, got control of it. I think John Kelly's done a remarkable job in bringing some order and discipline to the White House.
I got to ask you about campaigns, though. You've got campaigns where we didn't even know, none of us knew exactly what was going on. We knew there was Russian meddling, but not the extent of social media and all. What would be the political impact of orchestrating the firing of Robert Mueller at this point?
I think the political impact would be adverse for the president, clearly. I think if you don't have anything to hide, like some senator said, I can't remember which one it was, if you don't have anything to hide, act like it. Why fire him? Let him finish his investigation and conclude his report. Now, having said that, I agree with some of the things that I see coming out of the White House unattributed, that many of those prosecutors are hardline opponents of some of the things that I have believed in as a conservative Republican. But I don't think you fire the special prosecutor. You let him finish his job, and because that's the way our system works. We are, after all, a country of laws.
James Baker, thank you very much. Thank you for your service. It's great to be with you again.
Thank you.
Kristen Welker, back to you.